Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to the RIBA Future Architects Meetup. My name is Vincent Macdonald. I'm a final year MArch student from Lancaster, currently studying at Newcastle University, where I also completed my Part 1. I'm part of the team that has set up NCAN, the Newcastle Students Climate Action Network. We are a group that are creatively campaigning for a greater emphasis on sustainability in our architectural education. I'm looking forward to hosting this evening's event and hearing from our panel of speakers on this important topic. Firstly, thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you're all well and safe wherever you are in the world. It's amazing to be with you all from around the world tonight. After all, RIBA is a global professional membership body, and tonight we can truly all feel part of this huge community of architects globally. As we near the end of the academic year, we wish you all the best in the next few weeks and months of completing your studies for the year. The past 12 months have been extremely difficult, and we're all with you and wish you well. I would like to mention that a great source of support is RIBA membership. It is free to students studying their RIBA Parts 1 and 2, and as part of your membership, you will have access to the RIBA Future Architects programme. This provides a range of events, activities, resources and opportunities for members as you progress from Part 1 to Part 3 and on to qualification. I encourage you all to visit the Future Architects hub page on architecture.com and join the RIBA as a student member. Now, for a little bit of housekeeping, we're recording tonight's event so that those that can't join us live will be able to watch afterwards. We'll upload it to the RIBA Future Architects YouTube playlist for everyone to access. We invite you to use the Q&A function and say hello and send in questions and comments during the event. Do tell us your name, where you're studying, and who your question is for. We hope that the technology will work for us tonight, but if we do have any problems, we'll do our best to continue, and if that does become impossible, we'll contact you all to reschedule. We aim to finish tonight at about 7 p.m, so let's begin. Tonight, we'll be having a discussion around the role architects and the wider construction industry have on climate change. The built environment is responsible for about 40% of global carbon emissions. Architects have a responsibility to make a commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. We are pleased to welcome our panel of 4 speakers: Adrian Dobson, RIBA Executive Director of Professional Services, who will begin our conversation by setting out the wider goals of the profession in terms of climate change and what the RIBA are doing to respond. Following Adrian, we'll hear from Matthew Bell, Director of Medici Architects, then Rosa Whiteley, RCA graduate and Architecture Education Declares collaborator, and finally Paul Daramola from Re-Fabricate. Our speakers will provide insight on how their work and interests are geared towards supporting the fight against climate change. After the presentations, we'll then select and pose questions to the panel, so please do send in your comments and include who your question is for and try to be concise. So on to our first speaker tonight, RIBA Director of Professional Services, Adrian Dobson.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and good evening, everybody. What I'm going to do, just as a bit of a scene setter, I think, is just talk about 4 of the main pieces of RIBA guidance around the whole issue of sustainability that I hope will give a bit of context to our discussion tonight. I'll just try and share my slides if that will work. I hope you're seeing those full screen now, so hopefully you can see those okay. So these are 4 pieces of key guidance from the RIBA. The first I'm going to talk about is the RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge. So that is, if you like, our net zero standard, where we invite practices to commit to using their best endeavours to encourage their clients to meet a certain set of outcomes that are set out in the challenge, which I'll talk about in a minute. There's then a document called the Sustainable Outcomes Guide, which goes to a whole new level of detail and begins to map what's called the UN Sustainable Development Goals to the RIBA plan of work. And I'll also explain a little bit about how that then comes through into the plan of work itself. And then the final document I'm going to touch on this evening is what's called the RIBA Plan for Use Guide. And this is really all focusing on making sure that we do post-occupancy evaluation, and we actually make sure that the way in which we design our buildings in terms of carbon and other sustainability factors is actually reflected in the way in which they perform in use. So first of all, just turning to the RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge, this has been around for a period of around 18 months now. We set a series of sustainable outcome metrics in two categories, for domestic buildings and non-domestic buildings. And the three metrics that really apply most importantly are targets for operational energy. And you can see the benchmarks and the targets that we've set there for the dates going up to 2030. Targets for embodied carbon, and perhaps slightly more difficult to measure, and we may no doubt today talk a little bit about embodied carbon databases, etc. And targets for potable water use, and again you can see some targets laid out between now and 2030. So they're the three key metrics that the RIBA has set out for use by chartered practices. They're not necessarily methodologies that we ourselves have developed. So for example, the embodied carbon targets use an RICS standard, the operational energy target use the UK Green Building Council standard. We're keen to adopt existing standards where they're appropriate, and you'll see those standards on the right hand side of the slide. As well as the three key metrics, there are some what we call best practice health metrics, and these really relate to things like overheating standards, daylight factors, CO2 levels in buildings, that kind of thing, and you'll see those set out on the challenge sheet. So the slide you've got in front of you at the moment is the domestic targets, and then these are the targets for non-domestic buildings, commercial buildings and other types of buildings. So you'll see, following the same kind of format, but slightly different metrics for the two different building types. This diagram is really simply trying to say that this is the trajectory that we believe the buildings designed in the UK will have to sort of follow if we're going to get to net zero by 2050. And indeed, if we're going to achieve net zero in buildings, which is the RIBA's target, by 2030. So the targets that we've set, if you were to follow the minimum trajectory that's set out, you would reach the 2030 target. If you were to meet the satisfactory trajectory, you'd get there by 2025. But the key message to put across is that although the metrics are quite ambitious, it's quite clear, because we know from case studies, that buildings using current technology can achieve the targets already. So that little dark green box in the left hand side is really trying to make the point that we can achieve these targets with our buildings now, if the will is there and the clients are prepared to commission those types of buildings. This next slide is really taken from an organisation called the London Energy Transformation Initiative, or LETI. You may have heard of LETI. They've been doing some more work with which the RIBA has been involved, and when we set out the climate challenge targets, we did say that we tried to refine it beyond just domestic and non-domestic, and this is just to illustrate some work that's going on in terms of embodied carbon targets for different sectors of building in a slightly more granular way: office, residential, school, retail. So you can expect to see some updating of the climate challenge targets for different sectors over time. So really the challenge is to get more chartered practices to sign up to the 2030 Climate Challenge, and to make that commitment to use best endeavours to persuade their clients and project teams to try and work to these metrics. The next little thing I'm going to talk about is the RIBA Sustainable Outcomes Guide, and as I said, these are derived from the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I think there are 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and what the RIBA has done is it's taken a number of them and said, can they be applied, or where we think they can be applied, directly into architectural practice. And sometimes we've tweaked the terminology a little bit just to make it more accessible for the architectural community. So good health and well-being is taken straight from the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but net zero carbon emissions I think goes under sustainable energy or something like that in the UN Sustainable Energy and Development Goals. But you can see these are the areas that we've identified as being where we should be measuring sustainable outcomes in buildings: good health and well-being, sustainable water cycle, net zero carbon emissions, sustainable life cycle costs, connectivity and transport, communities and social value, net zero embodied carbon emissions, whole life carbon emissions, and sustainable land use and ecology. And those outcomes have then been reflected in the RIBA Sustainable Outcomes Guide. And again, we've used various methodologies that we believe practitioners can adopt in order to demonstrate that they are meeting those sustainable outcomes through the life cycle of the project. And this slide is setting out the different standards that we've used to map out those UN Sustainable Development Goals and show how architects can be making a contribution to the UK meeting the UN's goals. That then gets transferred into the RIBA plan of work. So within the plan of work, we've integrated those sustainable development goals and outcomes, and they've then been put into the plan of work, which, as you know, is the core design and construction process map for the UK construction industry. The last thing I'm going to touch on in a minute is to talk about the planning use guide, and this diagram begins to hint at that because it talks about stage 7 of the plan of work, the in-use stage, and the post-occupancy evaluation element. You know, the business that we need to learn from projects, demonstrate actually whether we're meeting the outcomes, and how we can take lessons from that for future projects. So the last piece of guidance I wanted to bring your attention to was this plan of use guide. And really, this is all about trying to encourage project teams to set realistic and measurable targets, to try and make sure their buildings do perform to those targets, and then to measure and provide feedback. So that's the fourth of the pieces of guidance I wanted to introduce you to. And then finally, just to close, I thought I'd mention one other thing, which is you may have seen some publicity recently about what's called the mandatory competencies that are proposed by the RIBA. These are in health and life safety, climate literacy, and ethical practice. And this slide illustrates what's called the knowledge schedule for the climate literacy mandatory competence. So this is scheduled to come into force in 2022 and will be subject to revalidation for all chartered members. And part 3 courses, or part 1's, part 2, part 3 courses by the point of graduation at part 3 should have also introduced the knowledge in this schedule. So I thought it was worth my while pointing out these schedules to you. They are available on architecture.com. And in actual fact, there's an open consultation for all RIBA members on the contents of the various knowledge schedules at the moment, so you can contribute to that consultation. So that was a fairly whistle-stop tour through those documents, but I hope it's useful as a kind of scene setter for the discussions and presentations we're going to have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for that. And now to give a response from a professional practice perspective, Director of Medici Architects, Matthew Bell.
Hello, thank you very much for having me today. Matthew Bell, Director of Medici Architects. We specialise in contemporary and sustainable design, and our key values are natural materials, breathable construction, passive design principles, social change, and local regeneration. These are some examples of our work. This is a social flats in Bury St Edmunds, and one of our eco dwellings. And here are just some more examples of the sustainable contemporary designs over the years. Most of these are some of our award winners. And that last one there is actually a small barn off-grid house conversion, which is my home. So today I've been asked to speak about sustainability from a practices point of view. So I've identified 3 areas in which architectural firms can have an impact. First, we can run our own company sustainably and ethically, or hold the companies we work for to account. Secondly, we can design the most sustainable buildings we are able to within the particular constraints of the project. And thirdly, we can question the limits set upon us, explore and theorize, and find better, more sustainable ways to do things. I'm going to run through these each one by one. So the element of sustainability that every architectural practice has most control over is how they run their own business. For example, every practice has the choice to bank with an ethical bank with a robust sustainability agenda, choose environmentally friendly products to use in the office, buy renewable energy only, or better yet, to create your own energy, base yourself in a sustainable location for both your team and your clients, and to be aware of, reduce, and to try to eradicate your carbon footprint. You may not choose to ever run your own practice, but you do have the ability to ask questions of the firm that you work for and to hold them to account. This is my team here at Stowmarket. We work in a small town in the middle of Suffolk. We chose it for its really good transport links, and this image is just to kind of show that actually 4 of those team members get the train to work, 3 of them walk, Two of us drive the electric car, and there's only two people in that photo who have to drive a petrol car, and they're both looking to move to one of the transport links so they can get on the train. And that all comes down to placement of your practice. Also, going to see clients, 95% of all our journeys to see clients and sites are in the electric car. That's charged from our renewable resource electricity that we buy, and in the summer it's charged from the excess energy of our off-grid system at home. That's the off-grid system on the right. Another thing that we decided to do when I took over the practice was to look at the legacy or the history of the practice and how much carbon footprint it had. We calculated that we needed to plant about 500 trees to offset that historic footprint. And we've actually bought a plot of land where we're creating a Medici woodland, and actually planted in the end twice the amount, just to make sure that we start off on the right foot. And now every year we're going to be looking at our footprint and saying, trying to get to negative. If we don't, we'll be planting trees, and it's a bit of a social event for the practice, as well as I said, the legacy of the woodland itself. And our offices as well, we're currently converting them. I'm in a temporary office here, but just around the corner we're converting our listed building with natural materials, and we're trying to be really efficient, so using just enough materials to achieve the efficiencies we need for the building. For example, that right hand image is the finished wall, how it's going to look at the end. We're not going to be plastering anything because there's no need to. Convincing architects to have sustainability at the top of their agenda used to be a huge part of our daily battle. However, eco no longer equals expensive. As such, our standard specification is now a fully natural superstructure, on top of which clients can choose enhances to the insulation or additional renewable or efficiency saving technologies. Eco should now be the new normal. This is the first dwelling I ever designed when I was a Part 1. I was very lucky to have a chance to design a dwelling. This building, I took it through as my Part 2 through Riba Stage 4, and then when I was doing my Part 3, I was the project architect on site, so managed to follow it through the whole way. And it involves most of our principles here at Medici. It's a natural superstructure, materials such as hemp, sheep's wool, timbers, limes rather than plasterboard, things like that. And it also embodies a lot of our strategies for energy and active systems here, so solar capture, water capture and reuse, dealing with all the waste on the site. For example, solid waste was composted and then kept for 2 years and spread on the land, and liquid waste go through a reed bed system to clean. And we also employed some passive systems. So instead of having to use MVHR, mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, we've got a passive ventilation system which brings in air under the ground. The earth is naturally cooling it in the summer or heating it in the winter. And that's drawn through to give fresh air in the building. And that's drawn through the use of passive stack ventilation. Medici has also been producing eco buildings for about 35 years, but we're still not satisfied with how sustainable our buildings are. We continuously challenge our own method of building. One example of this is one of the previous partners went out to France in the early 80s and saw the farmers out there using waste hemp shiv within their buildings to create insulation, so putting it into timber frame. And this was never used in the UK. He brought this technology back, had to get it through building control and fight with the council to make sure that we're allowed to use the materials, and then started producing some of the first hemp houses in the UK. Since then, these are some of the examples we've produced. And as you all probably aware now, this is quite a common material which is used by lots of architects. It's specified quite commonly now. Part of my research when I was a Part 2 student for my design thesis and dissertation was taking this a step further and looking at hemp stalk and seeing whether we can make this a construction material we can actually make structure with. And the reason for this is starting to say, well, timber is a sustainable material that we use quite a lot, but actually can we find something more sustainable than timber? And what we have, timber takes about 5 to 10 years to get to a point where we can use it within a building, whereas hemp could be an annually grown crop that we could plant a field up, harvest it, and then build a building out of it and do the same the next year. So this is some of the research and the structures that we've been looking at, and now we have a dedicated research wing here at Medici where we're testing some of these samples. We're lucky enough to get a UK grant, and we're going to be taking this through to using it within our office here as laths, testing out some hemp laths, but also in the next 5 years hoping to produce the first hemp structure house in the UK. So I'm going to leave you with this slide, which is my thoughts of what every architect should be doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. I would now like to welcome Rosa Whiteley, who is involved in Architecture Education Declares.
Right, I hope you can all see that okay. So yeah, I'm Rosa. I'm a designer and architectural researcher, mainly working kind of in the field between ecology and visual arts. I studied my BA at Manchester, and I recently graduated from the Royal College of Art in London last year. Within RCA, my projects looked at the intersection between politics, pollution, infrastructure, and resilient ecologies, but always with a strong focus on the climate and the politics around the climate. During my time at school, I became really interested, or my time at RCA, I was interested in how architectural education was or was not adequately preparing students for the realities of the climate crisis, and adequately preparing them and as future architects or future designers to operate appropriately within the world that we would be inheriting. I was interested in the dialogue around climate and spatial justice that was occurring within schools, and within the culture within schools, as well as the kind of culture and architecture as a whole, which led me to become part of some groups such as Architecture Education Declares, that wrote an open letter to the architecture education community calling for curriculum change. And the main thing that we discussed within those groups was that we felt that climate should be in every part of the students, of an architectural student's curriculum and every part of their education, and shouldn't be any kind of tokenal add-on that it sometimes felt like as environmental politics. So as I was saying, 77% of students feel that their course is not preparing them for the future of work, and 69% feel that their tutors are not responding adequately to the climate emergency, which is really concerning. This isn't even from a few years ago, and I think a lot of change has happened, but this is from this current cohort, as a study by the student branch of ACAN has found. But climate and architecture are just intrinsically linked, as has been touched on already, and it's why we're here, and it's why everyone's probably joined this call. But we know from the climate crisis and from studies around it that we're transforming a crazy amount of our land. More than half of the ice-free land on Earth is being transformed or redesigned effectively by human civilization, and also indirectly more than half of what remains. So people discuss this as the Anthropocene, this era that we're living in of changed climate that is controlled by humans, and the fact that this is a spatial change, it's a change to the land, and it's a change that's happened because of human decision, so it's a kind of form of design, shows that architecture and climate have to be considered together, and you can't really consider the built environment which architecture operates within without considering the climate crisis that we're heading into, or actually no, sorry, currently very much experiencing. So yeah, these were all the kind of things that were being discussed amongst student groups during my first year at RCA, and questioning whether or not that kind of form of architecture, that multi-scalar, multi-time architecture that's affecting everything that we're experiencing, that being the climate crisis, whether or not we were being adequately prepared, and we didn't really feel like we were. So we took a number of steps, and I'm going to say what my experience at the Royal College of Art was, because we wrote open letters as Architecture Education Declares to the general community, but we were more targeted within our different schools and that became really important to make like change within each school. So my first point would be to get to know your institution incredibly well. You can learn who's in charge and learn who cares and learn who will act on that care, and learn who holds the power and who can convince people to do stuff within the institution. Because institutions are there much longer than our students, and the staff are there much longer than the students. And to learn that structure is really important. Political systems and institutional systems come together and couple together with an architecture, and actually getting to know the institution that you're working within is a really good way to like experience this and understand this firsthand. So once you know who's in charge and who might have the power to make change, you can write letters. And we wrote many letters to different people within the institution and kind of had different agendas with them. So we had a lot of discussions about what could change within our curriculum and why it wasn't there already, because RCA is the School of Architecture and RCA is very climate focused and does a lot of research into it. And so we kind of trusted that change would want to happen. One thing that we did do is go through every bit of curriculum that we were experiencing as students. So we have like our dissertations, media studies, our studio crits, our studio briefs, history and theory, technology, and we went through every one and we questioned why that wasn't, that didn't have a direct climate agenda and how that could be added and suggested ways it could be added. So very directly demanded curriculum change. And another thing we did was write directly to the tutors of each studio group. So we operate with like 13 studio groups at RCA, and we asked them to directly talk about climate in their briefs that they set students, to make it not just part of technology or part of kind of a study, but really like think about creative answers to climate. Because the main thing that we all agreed was that we saw schools and architecture schools as like a powerful place to think through these ideas and be very present in the discussions. And it wasn't all about preparing us for operating in the professional field. It was also about how the research that happens in the schools and the creativity and space and time that students have actually could be great at contributing towards redefining architecture with regards to the climate crisis. And that became really important to discuss within the school, to then recognise that so much important discussions could happen if we could build a proper culture around it. So yeah, another thing is just to organise groups and demand good management. So organised groups means like organised talks, organised peer-to-peer discussions, like try and build a culture around it. But it's also just not the students' responsibility. The school has to build the culture, the school has to prolong that after you're there. And you need good management. And luckily we really did, and they organised loads of stuff and you could tell that they cared. But if you don't feel like the school is matching you in your energy, then you must demand better, because it's just not acceptable. Because the school should also be driving that. It's the responsibility of educators to be educating correctly. And the last thing is, if you don't get that, and if you don't feel like people are responding to you, protest, because that's just the appropriate way to be listened to sometimes. And also institutions are exploitative, not just in the way if they're not paying attention to education appropriately for climate and social and racial, and all of these problems that happen within institutions are very linked, and they should be banded together and worked with collectively. And that's all I've got to talk to you guys about. I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. A lot of great ideas there, especially for myself being part of a emerging climate action group too. So thanks for that. On to our final speaker of the evening. I'd like to welcome Paul Daramola from Re-Fabricate.
My name is Paul Daramola. I don't have too much of an introduction about myself, apart from the fact that I recently finished my Part 2 qualification at the University of Cardiff. When I say recently, I really mean last year, June, and I've been sort of working since. But I'm also a committee member of Refabricate, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. So fundamentally, I'm still a student, and I actually only started my Part 3 2 months ago, getting there. So The two things I'm really going to talk about today are waste reuse, or within the concept of a circular economy. But before I go into that, I have a few statistics to share with you. Firstly, being that the UK as a country, the UK actually produces 221 million tons of waste per year, and that actually equates to about 17,680 shards per year. So let that sink in for a second. But more importantly, of that waste that is being produced every year, the construction industry, construction, demolition, and excavation industry constitutes about 62% of that entire waste per year. So this was a key fact that we sort of took note of as we sort of burst Refabricate. And then going back to that circular economy concept, in order to talk about circular economy, you have to talk about the linear economy. Many of us might already know what this is, but for the sake of the part ones and part twos who are in this conversation, essentially a linear economy is a process that exists predominantly within many industries, but we're just going to talk about the construction industry. It's a process that essentially forces us to extract raw materials from the ground, process them, use them, and not consider the sort of the end use of that material, but more importantly, to produce producing waste along the way. In comparison to what a circular economy is, by the way, feel free to take screenshots because this might be a lot of information. But in comparison to a circular economy, the priority is about reducing the amount of waste that is produced along the way from the excavation to the use of the material. But within the built environment, there are two things mainly to be considered, like has already been discussed by the previous panelists, mainly to do with the material values and environmental needs. Within Refabricate, we sort of focus on the material values, but it's also to note that environmental strategies, for example, considering the structure, skin, services, space, and everything else in between that, and considering the environmental impact of that is important. But going on to the material values, what the real priority here is making sure that the process from the excavation all the way to use and all the way to reuse is traced and tracked and maintained per material. So Refabricate, Refabricate is led by a group of young people with an ambition to expand circular economy principles, as I've mentioned, into the architecture and construction industry. This is who we are. There's 6 of us in total. We have Kate, Giuseppe, Sophie, myself, Rosie, and Tiziana, who is our waste lady, as we call her, because she's sort of the expert on the team. We all work for architecture practices, but this is where we sort of come together with one agenda in mind, which is mitigating the effects of the climate crisis. So the fundamental principles of Refab are to empower young professionals within the circular economy and to connect them so that we're all sort of working together. That's how we started. We are still sort of doing that in a few other kind of aspects. But within those 3 concepts, we decided to put together a program in partnership with the RIBA, which has been sort of running for the last 2 years, so 2019 up until now. This is what the program sort of looks like in terms of personnel involved. We sort of partnered young professionals, part 1 and part 2s, who are working, plus craft professionals, created teams of about 6 to 7 people, and then appointed one of 5 different materials. So this was timber, aggregates, glass, textiles, and plastics. We appointed each of those materials to those individual groups. We appointed mentors to support them, and then essentially tried to create a program that allowed them to be as creative as possible and present a product that is the most sustainable product that they could come up with using those materials. A little bit complex, but that is an entire summary of what it was. We then had a launch event, pre-COVID, of course. We had Paula Sassi, who did a very good presentation about circular economy principles to teach them, and so that they can understand, because we found that a lot of young students actually didn't fully understand what a circular economy a circular economy entails. So that was great. I'll just run through some of the other photos. And this was actually a photo from one of our mentorship sessions, again, pre-COVID, where we had sort of a roundtable discussion and people were able to sort of brainstorm ideas and get feedback on the spot. So within the Refab program, one principle that we've tried to take into consideration is this waste pyramid, which takes everything from prevention, which sort of allocates the best case scenario right from prevention all the way to disposal. Of course, prevention of waste in the first place is the best case scenario, but everything else in between, preparing for reuse, recycling, and other types of recovery. All of which culminated in these 6 principles, which we've then taken throughout, and I'm going to also be presenting shortly. The 6 principles, I'll probably run through them quite fast, but they essentially entail, starting from the top, preventing and minimizing waste. That's always the best case scenario. Utilizing second life resources, that's number 2. Maintaining and prolonging building life, which has already been discussed today. Refurbishing, which has also been discussed today. And then reuse and redistribution of materials. And finally, recovery of waste. Now, unfortunately, it's fortunate and unfortunate, but more importantly, enlightening for us, it turns out that many of the projects that were sort of developed through the Refab program actually fell under the category of recovery of waste, which is something that we are now tackling in the introduction of our next program. However, we did have 2 other projects which sat within the second life resource and reuse and redistribution of materials. So, to run through those points again, preventing and minimizing waste. What we really want to sort of what we should be doing is to question whether a building is the answer in the first place. Do we actually need a building for whatever use we are proposing? Of course, residential sort of buildings could be questionable in that people do need homes, but in general, it is still an important question to ask some of our clients. That could already in turn reduce the amount of building area, for example, on site. And then a few other things like questioning the brief, material efficiency throughout, structural efficiency all the way through, which has also already been discussed in this presentation. Secondly, second life resources. Here, what the 3 points that we should be really considered are the reuse of existing buildings, which I'm going to talk about shortly, the reuse of building components of those buildings, for example, and to use recycled waste wherever possible. So within that, we had a team, Timber, who actually prioritized this concept throughout the development of their program. They had essentially acquired wood timber from a scrap yard and essentially redeveloped this into a beautiful kind of new piece of material that can be used to either construct a new chair, new products, furniture, panels for interior design, and various other forms. But it was the idea of taking waste, reprocessing it with very minimal use of chemicals, and redesigning it in a way that can be reused. Number 3, maintaining and prolonging building life. This is fairly straightforward. This is also very self-explanatory. The maintenance of the building is, of course, important throughout its entire life. Otherwise, it degrades over time. And also the materials that are used in the building also degrades over time, in which case the first point about reusing materials becomes somewhat obsolete. So maintaining and prolonging building lives is very important. Refurbishing. We already know what it means to refurbish buildings, but actually what I really want to talk about here is for us to consider within our boroughs or within the areas that we're working in, maybe proposing some existing buildings to our potential clients. And so instead of sort of building on a brand new site, we can say actually during our research we found this existing building. Why don't you sort of use this instead? That's something that we've been trying to do within my practice, even though we are a residential practice. I'm not going to go too much into that, but this is a sort of thought to be considered. And reuse and the redistribution of materials as a 5th principle. This right here is something that we are hoping within Refab to sort of prioritize forward. But again, it's the idea of reclaiming good materials. Of course, keeping in mind the grading of materials that are already being used on buildings, keeping that in mind, but making sure that it goes through a process of using those materials as opposed to proposing new materials on new buildings first. And this was a concept that was taken by the glass team within Refabricate. They had proposed this sort of scanning system, a tagging system that can be implanted within a piece of glass that sort of tracks its lifetime and also tracks its maintenance over time. So say 10, 15 years from now, you could essentially scan that chip and it gives you all the information that you need about the glass and how it's performed over time. And that becomes a sort of a new way of grading the type of glass. And then finally, waste recovery. This is something that is already very common in the UK, except the fact that when we recover waste within DEFRA, it's claimed that over sort of 90% of our waste is recovered. But actually, what that means is many is incinerated for the most part and turned into energy. So it's not necessarily recovery. However, recovery as a term does encompass a wide variety, a wide sort of a wide list of methods of recycling waste. But the priority here is essentially to reduce single origin and non-composite plastics, non-composite materials, and then finally, within this concept of recovering waste, is to consider the biodegradability of the waste that is being used. Of the material that is being used. So a few of the teams within a few of the projects within the Refabricate took this in mind. The first one on the far left is the team. This is Adrian's team. They actually produced this sort of new cup designed by essentially reprocessing coffee grounds that they had acquired from coffee shops, which was a really cool idea. Right in the middle is Team Timber. They had essentially taken timber, they had sort of blended it and turned it into this sort of new either insulation material for insulation or sort of acoustic panels that could be used within offices, for example. And finally, Team Textiles who acquired waste fabric and essentially turned this into a new piece of furniture with very, very minimal processing involved. All they literally did was strip it apart, turned it into threads, and sewed it into a new furniture. That chair actually sits in India at the moment. It's a pretty nice one. So in conclusion, taking these 6 principles in mind, prevention all the way to recovery, some of the questions that we really need to start asking ourselves, even as students, let alone when they're practicing, is where does the material come from? What is it made of? And how is it sourced? How long will it travel to get to the place that it needs to be used? Carbon footprint. How will it be fitted? How long will it be used for? The longevity, and where will it go? Where will it go when the building ceases to exist? So again, after use, and then what will it become waste or value? All of which sit within the concept of minimizing waste in construction. So finally, I'm just going to leave us with this quote. This is. Okay, I need to take off my name from that, but this was a quote that I coined during the Re-Fabricate program, saying that collaboration is key in designing a more sustainable future. There's a lot of us that do a lot of things. It's more importantly, we just need to come together and produce new ideas going forward. And finally, just going to leave us with a few resources. Feel free to take screenshots. I'm not going to run through them. That we found really helpful during the Re-Fabricate program. And if you want to find out more information about us, this is our website, www.refabricate.co.uk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was really great. And thank you to all of our speakers tonight. It's been inspiring to hear about the efforts that you are taking to change the outlook of the profession in terms of climate change. I'm sure our audience this evening is feeling inspired and eager to contribute further. Just before we move on to questions, we have a few announcements. There are some upcoming events and opportunities I'd like to share with you. On Monday next week, 26th of April, between 6 and 7:30 p.m, RIBA Future Architects discuss sleep deprivation. This event will explore sleep deprivation for architecture students, taking a look at habit formation, time management skills, and the importance of creating routines and a schedule that works for you. Secondly, the Norman Foster Travelling Scholarship is now open for applications, with the deadline of the 28th of May. The scholarship offers £7,000 to a student of architecture who demonstrates the potential for outstanding achievement and original thinking on issues that relate to the sustainable survival of cities and towns. The RIBA Part 1 and 2 bursaries are also open for applications. Again, the deadline for this is the 28th of May. The bursaries provide long-term financial support to architecture students who may struggle to cover living costs and the course-related expenditure. Links for these opportunities can be found in the event chat. Okay, so let's move on to some questions from the audience. I'll start with the first one that we've got, which is from a undergraduate student, And I think I'll come to Paul first from this because he flashed up some of his favourite readings and resources. So could you recommend any resources, books or websites that will help or inspire them in making sustainable design choices? I might come to everyone else as well for their favourite one too, but I'll come to you first, Paul.
Yes, so yes, one of the books that I found really helpful and is still helping me at the moment is the Zero Carbon Britain Centre for Alternative Technology. That book sort of provides enough resource for to be honest, anybody at any level. And then secondly, the Reuse Atlas by Duncan Baker Brown. That is a book I'm hoping to implement a lot more as I sort of continue along my profession. I am sort of still new to the architectural profession, but those two are really useful. And then finally, just the internet in general. You know, you could no matter the idea you have, it's just a Google search away really, and you're going to find articles talking about how it's sort of been how you could achieve it. But I'll say those two books and really just the internet in general. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Should we come over to Matthew next? What are your favourite resources?
That's a good question. I'm really into materials, so anything on specific materials I really enjoy to read. So there's some really good books on how to use hemp in construction or straw in construction, things like that. Generally, my true answer to that though is read everything but question everything. As architects, we should be very good at analysing what we read, and I think there's a lot of poor information out there. So hence the question's a good one, because I think you've got to wade through all the poor information to get to the good stuff. And all I would say is, like, think about what you're reading and think about how that makes you feel, and does it sit right with you. For example, some of the greenest so-called materials on the market at the moment are PIR insulations, petrochemical based, and tell yourself, is that really green? Surely not. So I would say read a lot but question everything.
Great, thank you. Over to Rosa. We'll come to you next.
I'd say, okay, there's two maybe. One relating to climate activism, How to Blow Up a Pipeline by Andreas Mann, which isn't as violent as it sounds, but it's advocating for appropriate and quick but good action with regards to climate, not necessarily architecture related, but it puts you in a good context for the necessity of the change. And another one, it's not really an architecture book, but Being Ecological by Timothy Morton is good for trying to rewire your brain to stop thinking like how people always think in ways around capital and politics that have led us to be in these situations, and think through ways to like operate in a different way. They would be my two.
Great, thank you. And finally, Adrian.
Oh, well, I would definitely say free resources. So do download the guides that I was talking about. If you type in RIBA climate action, you can get those. That's a free resource. The RIBA bookshop bestseller has been Biomimicry in Architecture. I think that's by Martin Pawley. That's more of an inspirational book, but it's been a big bestseller. And then the only other thing that struck my mind was, you know, the so-called oil crisis of the early 70s was the time when the sustainability movement first took off, and maybe interested to raid the libraries and see some of the stuff that was written then, because often there are some old ideas that could actually be quite good ideas. So maybe have a look at what was some books from the 1970s, perhaps might be in the university libraries.
Great, thank you. Well, hopefully some great resources for you all there. A couple of specific questions here. I'll come to Matt next. When hiring staff, whether that is part 1, 2 or 3, is it a requirement to exhibit work that clearly demonstrates knowledge and genuine personal interest in sustainability / living sustainably?
Good question. The short answer is no. I've very rarely found anyone that has any of those abilities coming out of university, and this goes back to some of the things that Rosa was saying. It's a really shocking how little that sometimes people know, but that doesn't matter because you can learn that on the job. We've recently, over the last year, we've taken on another 6 members of staff, Only one of them had a grounding in sustainable knowledge, but everyone else is learning. As long as there's a willingness and an interest in it, that's all that matters. And living sustainably, I think, part of the reason we employ people in our practice is because they're interested in this agenda. So I would hope that would be just a natural interest and a natural way that someone wants to live. So that probably is a bit more important to us. I will say, if I'm allowed to do a little plug here, actually, that we are part of the government's Kickstart scheme. So anyone that's coming out of uni courses over the next 6 months that is looking for placements, please do get in contact with us. We're offering 6-month placements for people that can't find work elsewhere.
Great, excellent answer to that. I'll come to Adrian next. What is the expected take-up from architectural practices for Architects Declare? And do you believe it is generally taken seriously by most practices, or are practices using it as eco-wash?
Gosh, that's quite a bit of a leading question, that one, into that as well. I mean, I think, yes, I mean, we saw when Architects Declare came out, there was a big take up, and I think, but one of the questions has been about, how that impacts upon the decisions you make about who you're going to work with. So I think there's been, the Architects Declare has shown the appetite there is. I think the RIBA with the 2030 climate challenge, we face a slightly different problem in that we've got about 210 practices that have signed up, and we'd like about 500. And I think, if anything, we've got the opposite problem, that people are afraid that they'll be held to the metrics. Do you know what I mean? If they have buildings that don't meet those metrics, they'll somehow be criticised. So I think what we've got to sort of put across is that really what we're after is people to show best endeavours, is the best way I can put it, to try and work with clients to persuade, to use your influence, but then to record the actual performance so we can see what progress we're making. So I think we've got a communication barrier to overcome, to say we're not saying every project has to meet these targets, but we'd like people to adopt that aspiration. Does that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, thank you. The next question is aimed for Rosa. Can you give an example of the most powerful change that you've helped create with protest? It's a shame we have to resort to such things, but it's such a powerful tool.
I would say that, to be honest, I wouldn't say that I personally, me, myself, and only I have instigated a protest that's made huge change. I think protests have the ability to make really big change. I've been to lots of the larger climate protests. As I said, at RCA, they were really receptive to our requests. And the bigger, or not more important, but just as relevant protests that they had at RCA were to do with workers' rights and working, inequality amongst staff. And I think we as student groups saw that as an equal and not even just equal, the same battle to do with institutions and large organizations not recognizing social and spatial justice. So yeah, I'm not gonna claim to have been an instigator of a huge changing protest, but they're very important, and if change needs to happen, then we should do them.
Thank you. Yeah, very inspiring. And our last question tonight is for Paul. Cardiff University is known as a forward-thinking university when it comes to climate change and research. Did you feel it was disseminated into the course you studied when you were there?
Yes, it was actually a mandatory requirement by every unit. So I just thinking of what Rosa was talking about. So I wonder if she sent a letter to Cardiff as well. Yeah, I think the course that I picked specifically was, the unit that I picked specifically wasn't necessarily about the climate what I picked, but it was more I was put into. It wasn't necessarily about the climate emergency, which is a little bit sad for me, but at the same time, I was in Re-Fabricate, so that was my way of doing my other half. However, within that unit, we were required to sort of implement new technologies, i.e. AI, and write scripts and algorithms to essentially decipher the carbon emissions and the sustainability of a building, for example, towards a zero carbon kind of future. So that was the way that we did it in my unit. It was more about technology and how that could impact the kind of this kind of conversation. However, within the university itself, there was one unit which was newly introduced in the year that I started, which was I started in 2018, but actually it was introduced in 2019 for my second year, and it's called 1.5 degrees. And it's a brand new unit, and I think they're looking to sort of continue that unit all the way through for the future of Cardiff University. And that was specifically about, as the name implies, 1.5 degrees, specifically about the climate emergency. As you can imagine, when the presentation for that, the unit leader did that presentation, over I think 20 to 50 people signed up, but they only had spaces for 11. So a lot of people were disappointed, including myself, to not be able to get in. So to answer the question shortly, yes, the direct response of Cardiff University was to introduce a brand new unit, which they're looking to continue going forward, called 1.5 degrees. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I hope that's something that lots of other architecture schools across the country do, and or if they don't, hopefully can replicate and add to as well. I'll have to draw the meeting to a close now because we're unfortunately running out of time. But I'd just like to thank everyone else, all our speakers tonight, for such a wide range of really important topics and loving all of your work towards the climate crisis which we're all facing. So I'd like to thank all of our panel for their updates and response tonight, and thank you to all who have attended the meeting this evening. We hope this has been useful and provides you with insight to take forward into the rest of your architectural education and working life. You will receive a post-event feedback form, so please take 2 minutes to complete this so we can continually develop the Future Architects programme. And remember to sign up as an RIBA member to stay in touch as part of the network. Thank you again and stay safe. We look forward to our next meetup. Good night.